For over 46 months, Russia is waging war on Ukraine. And today we want to examine the military situation in the country. My name is Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start in the southern Ukrainian region of Zaporizhzhia. There, a new video from the Russian army proves that what Russian military bloggers and also the Russian Ministry of Defense claim, it's propaganda. They claim they've seized the key frontline town Stepnohirsk. Let's look at the video. It shows that the town center here, covered in winter snow, is clearly still under Ukrainian control, with no visible signs that it has been taken as of now. How do we know? We've got Russian airstrikes and artillery attacks on the high rises in the center of Stepnohirsk. That means we can see it pretty clearly, including the timing. These are recent attacks. This video was only published a few days ago, actually just yesterday, that Stepnohirsk at least still has the high rises in the city center under Ukrainian control. Over the past days and weeks, we've shown time and again that another district, also a high-rise area, but very characteristically square. It's built differently than the southern one, so we'll see it on the map soon, and it's under Russian control. Now we're seeing, for the first time ever really, that the city center remains firmly under Ukrainian control, clearly and securely held and actively defended. The whole thing is kind of, like I said, a clear and outright debunking of Russian propaganda that had already been claiming they'd long since moved past Stepnohirsk. They said they were north of it, actually taking the small villages south of the city of Zaporizhzhia. And here you can once again really see the devastating airstrikes. By now there's no snow left here. That's because, just to repeat, we're in southern Ukraine. It's a few degrees warmer here, and we had a few days of snow, but not anymore. And now we see this artillery strike on that high-rise, and then we see how, what is it in total, almost 10 floors of the building collapse. That once again means total devastation, and again, we're not in the Donbass, we're not in the Kharkiv region in the east of the country, but right in the center, in the south of Ukraine. Here too you can see the large high-rise districts being leveled to the ground by Russia when they're not able to capture these cities, and well, when the Ukrainians don't flee, with many civilians left unable to escape, before virtually every single house had been destroyed. We'll look at it on the map, then see how important Stepnohirsk is for the defense of Zaporizhzhia city. This shows the south of the country when we're not going into the east, and you can see it quite clearly. We've still got about 25 kilometers from Stepnohirsk to the outskirts of Zaporizhzhia. Zaporizhzhia has about 700,000, so it's a sizable city. And that's why it's so important that Ukraine holds on to this city. Here we can see the current map from Deep State Map. This is a map that doesn't include Russian propaganda, but is very realistic overall indeed. Let's drive in now, and we can actually see that over the last days and weeks. Like I already said, this square here is pretty visible from the roads, kind of a diamond you can make out on the map, and if you look closely, the shape stands out clearly on the satellite view. That's what the Russians have taken. The part of Stepnohirsk is under Russian control. What we just saw were attacks on the center of Stepnohirsk. This map also shows everything is orange, meaning it's contested, but as we just saw, the Russians wouldn't dare to advance any further into that area right now to shell the center with heavy artillery if their own troops were there. So we can be fairly sure that the center of this small town, which used to have just under 10,000 inhabitants, still remains firmly under Ukrainian control right now. From Zaporizhzhia in the south of Ukraine, we then move to Donetsk in the east. There we have new footage from the Lyman region that on the one hand shows us that the Ukrainian army is indeed trying with its offensive units to push forward steadily to retake positions. We can observe the Russians who were captured in the large forests there. You can see here in winter camo, Ukrainian special forces advancing into a deep, heavily wooded part of this huge snow-covered forest. The whole area is really sparsely populated, lots of forest with hardly any fields nearby. Not like the region around Donetsk with all those mining areas for ore and coal. It's really just huge, uninterrupted tracts of forest. And what this shows us on the one hand is that the Ukrainians are successfully managing to clear out or mop up individual Russian positions here. We see that the grenades are thrown in first here. The positions are usually so deep that, as we'll see in a moment, hardly any wounded Russian soldiers come out. However, it's important to say it's a huge forest, and the Ukrainians, with their few soldiers, their offensive units, can only work on a very small part of it at a time. That they can go in there, we're now seeing the Russians who'd been holding out there start to surrender. So these are really pinpricks, including those Ukraine is inflicting. Yeah, people here keep getting killed by drones otherwise. In this case, they were actually taken prisoner in the positions. But all in all, Russia is advancing in this forest across so many square kilometers and everywhere at once that it's extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to fend off all the Russian pushes here and hold their ground. And the next video shows that too, from the Lyman region, from the small village of Jarowa. And here we can see that the Ukrainians really can only watch, you might say, as Russian soldiers. I hope you can make them out here in the middle of the village, move around inside the village with no way to stop, confront, or otherwise challenge them. Going from house to house and apparently meeting residents who are at least neutral, if not pro-Russian, in this village, and then asking them for information about how things will proceed here or what the next steps might be here locally. So we can see Russian soldiers moving here in Jarowa, in this case even without any Ukrainian drones nearby at all to fend them off. This clearly shows, as you can see here, the village and right beside it, that noticeably large forest. Here the Russians have actually managed to push into the next settlement through the woods. And the Ukrainians just weren't able to stop them. We're looking at this on the map, and you can see Jarowa is still officially shown here in blue at the moment. But the map must be several days behind reality here and simply hasn't been updated to reflect the recent changes at all, it seems. Let's first take another look at why Lyman is even so important. The footage we just saw was, on the one hand, from the big forest out here east of Lyman, and the other shots were up here from Jarowa, showing the surrounding high ground. We'll get to that in a minute. Why is it so important? You can already see that Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the last two big cities in the region, are directly dependent on it, that Lyman holds firm. If Lyman falls, the Russians could basically advance from the north straight onto the two last big cities still held by Ukraine and Donetsk, and likely overrun them quickly. We're zooming in here a bit now, and you can see the situation I was just trying to point out. On the one hand, the Ukrainians here, for example, have managed to keep the Russians at bay. That was the video we just saw. On the other hand, the Russians in the past few days have also been able to, with lone soldiers as seen, pushing into the blue area toward Jarowa. And there are even videos proving that the first Russian soldiers have already arrived here in Stepnohirsk, as can clearly be seen. Another former resort town where there used to be loads of hotels right in that big forested area. You can also see the river running along here. I hope you can make that out. Right, we've marked it too. The Siversky Donetsk. So it's a large, important river in the region. It even gave the region its name. And that's why it's really a big problem for the Ukrainians that they can only hold the front in places and only partially across many areas. In places, the Russians have even gotten well behind their lines. And sadly, we've seen that in the villages, there are pretty much no Ukrainian soldiers behind the front. They're all at the front, forming a very thin net there. Of course, there are some strong points behind them. For example, Lyman City and Jarowa in particular too. We just saw it, apparently with no Ukrainian defenders at all. So the Russians were able to move around there fairly freely. From Donetsk, we head a bit further west to the Dnipropetrovsk region. There we have new footage of the Ukrainian Armed Forces 46th Airborne Brigade, showing how Russian attacks around Novopavlivka can be repelled as well, demonstrating their tactics in recent fierce fighting. Fairly successful here. Time and again we see kamikaze drones being guided onto Russian soldiers in their positions on the ground with lethal, unerring precision. Interesting. Groups of 2 or 3 Russian soldiers trying to push forward. Ukrainian panels show Russians aren't expelling soldiers, and that's the problem for the Russians. They're very easy for the Ukrainians to spot, either because they've got poor camouflage, so you can see the 2 Russians moving here, or, as in this case, that the Ukrainians are using thermal vision. You can also see the bodies pretty clearly from the surveillance drones. You can make out the body temperatures well in the cold surroundings. So it's pretty easy for the Ukrainians to strike here, basically with little effort and precision. We see this footage, really awful footage, once again from a human point of view, because you can see that each of these drones kills a person, kills a Russian who's moving. These are very disorganized units here, at least one armored vehicle, and it's got mine protection as well to boot without question. But I'm not sure whether it was a Ukrainian vehicle left behind. Anyway, the 2 Russians are now being attacked directly and are then subsequently neutralized by Ukrainian forces right there on the spot. This also shows us in Dnipropetrovsk the Russians keep up the attacks. Russia is trying in this case to take Novopavlivka, a strategically important town. We'll look at it on the map in a moment. However, the Ukrainians are holding them off with a variety of drones swarming in. Like I said, the 46th Air Mobile Brigade is active here. We can also see the Russians are using these robots in several different places. That's not normal anymore either. The Ukrainians do it more often, but it's getting increasingly common to see people try to shift part of the logistics when you don't have... If you don't have donkeys or horses or whatever, or those carriers, yeah, you could almost call them slaves. The mercenaries being used there, then you try to use these robotic systems. Next, also from the 46th. Some really interesting footage here in the border area between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk, so the same area as before, showing us that the Ukrainians have rigged a kind of fishing pole onto their own drones, apparently, to intercept enemy drones. We can see it fly in, and unsurprisingly they try to strike the enemy drone's rotor to disable it right away. Here we can clearly see the fishing line getting caught in the rotor of the Russian drone, causing it to then crash unexpectedly a short time later. The Ukrainians sometimes try that multiple instances. We're now seeing winter terrain from the last few days again, and you can see it clearly here. Let's hope you can make it out, basically the cable running down here. And if it hits one of these 4 rotors, then that's it for the Russian drone, plain and simple. They've already used it against larger drones too, but we'll take a look at that later. Because Russia, of course, still has an absolute, well, not dominance, but actually a rather awful lot of those Molnja drones in the area. And finally, footage that shows us what we've unfortunately kept seeing over the past weeks or even years now, the Russians storing their ammunition out in the open time and again in plain sight. You can't see it well here, it's a bit lower, hope you can make it out. Here are TM62 anti-tank mines and now the Ukrainian drone, which can easily fly straight in, you see it at the last moment, and trigger a massive explosion and destroys that Russian weapons depot. We'll take a look at it on the map. Like I said, we're in the Dnipropetrovsk region, but right on the far southeastern edge, where Donetsk begins next. And all the footage we just saw comes from that same region, just south of Novopavlivka, filmed in the nearby areas and surrounding countryside. We've marked this area here as contested by Deep State Map, our map provider. However, we currently have information that there are no more Russian soldiers in Novopavlivka, but that most of them were driven out, pushed back down toward the south. And you can pretty clearly see this dashed line here. That's not just the oblast border, it's also the Vovcha River marking the boundary between the areas. That's also the river we just saw in some of the footage where the Russians keep trying to push from south to north to attack here, and the Ukrainians hold this area. What I'd marked in yellow here, an area of maybe 5 by 10 kilometers where they're trying to kill every Russian pushing north through here before they can actually reach Novopavlivka a bit further up, stopping them there. But that shouldn't hide the fact that the Russian army is still using its drones every day, not just to hunt Ukrainian soldiers, but also to go after Western equipment, in this case, specifically German-made military gear. Here we can very clearly see an attack by a Russian fiber-optic guided drone on a buried, dug-in Panzerhaubitze 2000 from Germany right here. So this is really an expensive piece of kit being attacked here, but interestingly, as we'll probably see at the end of the video, this drone here doesn't seem to explode, but instead it just falls down. It's meant to crash in here. We can clearly see it doesn't hit. So that's the problem for the Russians. It just ends up lying here atop the Panzerhaubitze 2000. And so the Russians then pull up their you can see that. So right up until the very last moment we have the situation that there's no signal anymore, but the impact fuse apparently didn't work either, at least from what we can tell. So we don't see any more footage either. Normally we always see like 1, 2, 3 of these drones strike and then the fire at the very end, you know. That's how it's shown in a lot of the Russian propaganda videos. Here it seems to have been different. The drone was probably a dud, didn't detonate, and so the crew and even the German vehicle basically got away with a fright. If you want, the red you see here, we saw that pretty clearly too. That's just the lamp that was activated right there in exactly that spot. Nevertheless, Russia is still active with its fiber optic drones to, well, take out as much Ukrainian equipment as possible, even behind the front. We know the self-propelled howitzer can fire up to 40 kilometers. To hit them directly. Not only the Russian army uses fiber optic drones, Ukraine does too. And what we're seeing here now is a tactic that used to be Russian and has now been taken up by a Ukrainian unit. This is a typical loitering drone, the kind we've been seeing again and again over the past days, weeks and months. Basically a drone made of fiberglass that's just parked and waiting. You wait for the enemy to come by and then you tail him. Let's just let it run now, because in this case we can see 2 Russian motorcycles coming by. And now this really turns into a fight for life and death. The fiber optic drone is now chasing the Russians. And we see once again the pilot's skill, you have to say, because he's flying, as we keep seeing, between the trees, even under the cables, very deftly and with precise control, under the power lines above him. Now we've seen it, so he basically left the road, is flying here trying to take shortcuts, and at the end of this 30 to 40 second chase, as it all finally comes to a close now, where the Russians try to speed away, it's actually the drone pilot who wins, taking him out, knocking the Russian soldier clean off his motorcycle and sending him tumbling to the ground. We can see it in the next shot, the motorcycle now lying by the roadside. I hope you can make it out clearly, including the wounded or allegedly dead Russian soldier. So that means once again a fiber optic pilot who, from some bunker, pulled off better, faster and ultimately deadlier maneuvers than the motorcycle rider on the Russian side. We can see how unbelievably dangerous these fiber optic drones are now. So, what is Russia doing about it? They're trying pretty much every possible precautionary measure against drone attacks, and one of them actually seems kind of surreal. Let's take a slightly closer look here. This footage was actually released by the Russian army. What looks like Teletubbies here are tents meant to protect the soldiers inside from these drone attacks and help conceal their positions from aerial surveillance. Nobody's 100% sure whether this is supposed to somehow give the soldiers warmth, make it harder for the drones to see, or whether it even serves some other tactical purpose we don't yet fully understand. Maybe an anti-thermal function, so these setups would kind of muffle the soldier's body heat a bit, meaning it wouldn't be possible anymore for the Ukrainian drones' thermal cameras to reliably pick them up from any significant distance. You can't say for sure, but the footage is pretty wild, what you see here, and it was reportedly filmed from inside one of those tents, apparently, as some claim. And down here you can see the whole unit was fitted out with these tents. Soldiers now walk like this. The field of view, we see it. Hope you can see it. The field of view is always just this small, really limited. Yeah, the whole thing is kind of just really bizarre footage. Honestly, it's just weird. That said, in Russia, or at least in this unit of the Russian army, they seem to think when they give this to the soldiers on their way to the Ukrainian position, they'd have a better chance against Ukrainian drones. I think the next few days and weeks we'll be waiting for the videos will show how successful this Russian tactic actually is. And finally, as always, we come to long-range strikes from both sides, or at least mid-range ones. First, we'll look at footage from Kharkiv. It shows another branch of Nova Pochta, the Ukrainian postal service, which was attacked and largely destroyed by Russian bombs in a recent strike, leaving it severely damaged and unusable. Why does Russia keep attacking Nova Pochta? We know that this post handles a huge amount of shipments. There are branches of that post in Germany now, and you can send almost any kind of support, any help, as long as it doesn't explode, of course. You can send night vision gear, you can send bulletproof vests or food, basically anything. Of course, there are millions of completely civilian, ordinary shipments being sent, and of course also, for example, by Ukrainians who fled to Poland and Germany to their families back in Kharkiv, that they there, for example, now because of the Russian attacks might need something, a warm sweater or something very similar indeed. Because of that, Nova Pochta has now found itself squarely in the Russians' crosshairs. Tragically, 4 people were killed here in total. In that attack, it was a nighttime strike. People were working at the post office to get packages ready for the next day. And so once again, a crime by the Russians who just attacked this civilian company, the new post in Ukraine, and killed several of its employees. So what is Ukraine doing about these medium-range attacks? Of course, it's trying to shoot the drones down. We know that Russia is using a whole bunch of drones, especially the Shaheds, but they're operating at considerably shorter ranges. Basically at roughly 50 kilometers, some even claim in exceptional cases up to about 90 kilometers, these small Molnja drones are now being deployed. Each one of them has a warhead on the front. Let's take a look at this. Maybe you catch it at the last moment. You can make it out up here. There's the warhead on it. Most of the time it's a TM62 mine packed in here, and the Ukrainians are trying to bring them down from the sky. And there are many experts for that by now. Here we can see a unit called Taiwaz active in the field, and this unit now proudly claims that with these interceptor drones in service, from Mr. Sternenko, from this fund that sells or gives these drones to units using donations they've collected. They claim, as they've been reporting so far, that with these drones here they were able to intercept 26 Molnja drones in total. You can partly see what sort of populated areas they are. That's quite well behind the front, so that means big cities are being hit. Earlier we saw Zaporizhzhia, about 700,000 people. Molnja drones have already struck there too. Pavlohrad is another large city in neighboring Dnipropetrovsk. Molnja drones have already struck there too. So the whole thing is an extreme danger, not just for the Ukrainian military, but for any kind of critical infrastructure or even the mail. We just saw it, though they're being attacked with them. Here we can see it again pretty clearly. Behind it you can see the landscape, basically. And now this drone, which gets intercepted right up there by the Ukrainians, as you can clearly see. Yeah, an extremely important task the Ukrainians have there. Lots of units are pushing it at once. They keep doing this and intercept those Russian drones every single day around the clock. But it's not just the Russians using these medium to short-range drones to attack opposing forces. Ukraine does that too, but far more precisely. This is the last video we'll watch today. Here, once again, it's multi-million euro systems of the Russian army that were just destroyed by Ukrainian units here behind the front. We can see there are 3 military targets. First, a radar that's just being attacked. The Ukrainians are showing us this again to point out exactly what kind of air defense targets you go after here with your drones and what's being struck. This is all roughly about 100 kilometers behind the front. Basically the range these drones have to reach and to successfully strike those targets there. And these are meant to be all targets that were struck here in occupied Ukraine, specifically beyond Crimea. Next, if I'm not mistaken, a Tor M2, that's a modern one too, yes. An interceptor system, and once again we can see it's even moving, so it's underway, trying to make a run for it. Maybe they spotted the incoming drones, but that doesn't help them much now. The Ukrainian drones are being actively piloted live by remote operators. They can adjust their course right up until the last moment and thus steer straight into this relatively valuable Tor M2 system, striking it dead on and neutralizing it entirely. These are footage the Ukrainians put out to show, yeah, we're active behind the front lines. But unlike in the Russian case, it doesn't just end up hitting everything in the Tunguska system that's attacked. It mainly hits those systems that our long-range pilots also rely on and depend on during their missions. Meaning they could stop long-range drone pilots from pushing deep inland, for example, from Russia to attack gas and oil installations there. So it's all very interconnected, and that's the Ukrainian approach. They try to knock out enemy air defenses at medium range, and then, with other drones shortly afterwards, to then follow up and strike vital infrastructure targets even further away. Recently, Ukrainian strikes hit the Caspian Sea. In other words, a very tightly knit system on the Ukrainian side, set up to strike military targets and other targets critical to the Putin regime deep inside Russia and even beyond its borders.